Hidehiko Araki has always had an appreciation of the horror genre, and weaves aspects of horror into his main series, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. From subtle references to straight up making large amounts of the series' antagonists from part 1 through 3, vampires. Though instead of directly copying the general strengths and weaknesses of vampires, Araki decided to create his own version of them, adding yet another take to the many mythoses. And while I have covered vampires slightly in the past, I thought it would be good in the spirit of October to take a closer look at vampires as a whole and see where Araki was coming from when he crafted them. Now, vampires in JoJo obviously take major influence from their either folklore or pop culture counterpart, seen best in how the setting of Part 1, Phantom Blood, is influenced in part by one of the most recognizable versions of the vampire myth, Dracula. This is seen best in Part 1's own Victorian setting, how the horror quickly becomes personalized for the protagonist, and the assistance from a weirdo hermit who has a knack for killing creatures like vampires. And it even comes down to a battle between man and beast, being one of the major tones of Phantom Blood. Though Dracula wasn't the sole influence on the vampires in Part 1, as Araki would blend together multiple elements from different breeds of vampires from different mythoses together into a single cohesive monster. So to help us get a better understanding on where these traits originate from, let's start by getting a basic understanding of vampires as a whole. So vampires, down to the name, is a very ancient term, with no fully concise explanation behind the origin of it, with a lot of theories suggesting that the name itself comes from a Slavic origin, be it either a modified version of the Turkish word for witch, or specifically the Czech word for to bite and violently thrust. Either way, the concept of vampires has existed through a dozen of different cultures, from Mesopotamian to Hebrew to even ancient Greece, with even some writing about vampires being worshipped like godlike beings from a certain sect of paganism. Though during this period, the beasts took on a much different form, being more monstrous in appearance and described as either witches, demons, or reanimated corpses in a similar vein to the modern zombie. Along with this came the common claim that if a vampire bites you, then it will drain you of your blood and you will become a vampire yourself, which in turn built upon the myth and led to some bouts of hysteria, though the people only feared their presence at night, which led people to believe that the creatures were either allergic to or couldn't stay out in the sunlight. Though once the stories reached Europe, they were about to change, as while the myth was kept mostly intact during early renditions of European vampire stories, having them be these monstrous, bloated, or creepy figures, like anything with a partial Germanic origin, portions of it were significantly changed to fit the more romanticized imagination of the time, with vampires becoming more physically attractive and gaining traits such as eternal beauty, superhuman strength, and in some cases a hypnotic presence that would allow them to casually hide among normal society, commonly depicted as aristocrats prying on the common folk and bleeding them dry, which is biting social commentary if I've ever heard any. Along with this, vampires would begin to gain supernatural abilities alongside their already sort of creepy abilities to help explain more phenomenons around the entirety of Europe, with them gaining things such as shape-shifting, where they could turn into vampire bats or werewolves or sometimes even fog. Though the stronger the vampire got, the more weaknesses were created to sort of balance them out. And of course, one of the main ones known, due to European religious tendencies, a lot of holy items were deemed extremely powerful against the undead, including vampires, be it crosses, holy water, or even churches as a place of safety. Along with this, other defense mechanisms were created to ward off the monster in a varied set of ways, be it garlic or even rice. Along with that, they weren't even allowed to enter your home unless you invited them. It would seem that with each iteration of the vampire came its own iteration of its weaknesses, which the whole collective monster would inherit, and along with that came multiple methods to completely destroy them, with one of the largest and most held beliefs between all different versions of the story being a stake through the heart. But a lot of cultures disagree on the specific wood that needs to be used or else it won't be effective. Though soon the impaled would become the impaler, when Vlad the Impaler would take on the name the Count of Dracul, which means Count of the Dragon, and was later converted into the name Dracula, which was the inspiration for the book of the same name. But of course you also have other methods of destruction such as decapitation, incineration, and of course, the sun. Though throughout the years, vampires would change and grow, and eventually the concept would land in the hand of Hidehiko Araki, who would begin to pick and choose different elements from from the vampire mythos to craft his own unique set of vampires, starting first with his method of obtaining the power, this being by donning the stone mask of the Pillarmen, who were these ancient demigod-like creatures from ancient time, likely playing on the concept of those old godlike figures that subsect of paganism were worshipping and considered to be blood-sucking monsters. Though back to the stone mask. How it would work is the person would don the mask and then feed it blood. This blood would trigger it and cause it to pierce the user's brain with these rib-like tendrils that awaken them to a various set of new powers. And in this form, the person would be granted eternal youth, reverting to or maintaining their beauty from their early 20s, as stated in JoJo 6251. Along with this, thanks to the mask affecting their brain, the person would be compelled to do evil, and they could always get their daily vitamins by just sucking it out of their targets. But they didn't do it purely through bites like the old vampires of myths and legends, though some more theatrical ones did. But now they can suck it out through mere contact, by sticking their hands in the person and draining it through the blood vessels in their fingers. Though don't get it wrong, JoJo vampires do share that same physical trait of large fang-like canine teeth, but instead of using them purely for biting, they can also break them off and spit them out like miniature missiles when attacking, which is only one of the many changes to vampire lore Araki would undertake. Along with this, vampires in JoJo could also perform more body horror-like feats, as Araki found body horror to be some of the most interesting things to draw. And these feats would match up somewhat well with the folklore, but it was more so converting the ideas from folklore vampires into a new form. A good example being converting the shapeshifting abilities into more of a feat of ultimate flexibility and body mastery, with things like Wired Beck being able to turn his hair into spikes or his body into a door. And on top of that, they have full control over their bodily functions, allowing them to either shoot pressurized fluids out of their eyes in an attack called the Space Ripper Stingy Eyes, which functions in a similar way to a high-powered water jet, with pressurized liquid being able to cleave cleanly through stone. This is also likely in reference to the natural ability of the Horn Lizard, which can pressurize its own blood and shoot it out of its eyes as a defense mechanism. But with that in mind, you also have their control over their body's temperature in the form of vaporization freezing technique, which allows vampires to reduce their own internal body temperature to the form that it freezes over, and then transfer that loss of heat to anything they touch. And this is seemingly in reference to vampires being extremely cold to the touch, likely because for the most part they were inhabiting corpses. Which, funny enough, is an aspect of vampires that Dio actually actualizes on in Part 3. And I'm willing to bet that these biological abilities are all designed the way they are because Araki is somewhat obsessed with the ultimate bioweapon in swords. I mean, like, honestly, he's one step away from being an Umbrella scientist at this point. And speaking of Umbrella, Araki would also implement the origins of vampires in one of their earliest connections to traditional zombies, as a vampire could place their essence into someone and turn them into something that is referred to in-universe as a zombie. Though if a vampire offers up purely their blood, they can convert a person into a vampire, though the zombies created by vampires would take on the more beast-like features that the vampires of early times were known for. And on top of the conversion ability of vampires, they can also project a compelling hypnosis through their eyes and dominate those with weaker wills, as seen with Jack the Ripper and Poco, which is somewhat based on the common power found in Hollywood vampires and would frequently be used in the Dracula series of movies, actually. And it should also be noted that while Araki didn't want to portray a lot of Dio's vampiric powers during Part 3, he did end up using a lot of vampire-based imagery when depicting Dio, having him always walking around in the shade or obscured by shadow, which made him seem very similar to things like Nosferatu, who was depicted a lot from the shadows, due to his horrific appearance. Along with this, if a vampire trained their abilities enough in JoJo, they could convert their own cells into flesh buds, which they could use to mind dominate someone in a similar fashion to their hypnosis. And if someone were to try to remove this mind domination, it would kill its host and then attack the person trying to remove it, likely in an attempt to take over that person. And those infected with a flesh bud, post the death of the original vampire who owned the cell that created the flesh bud, will also be violently mutilated after that vampire's passing, as it would seem that the vampire has control over all those flesh buds, and without them actually being there to maintain it, they just go wild. Though killing a vampire in JoJo is going to be tough, because Araki tweaked their weaknesses, as well as crafting a few of his own, removing a lot of the humanizing ones, such as the stake through the heart or decapitation, seemingly parodying those ideas when Dio gets impaled through the chest by the statue, or when he gets beheaded multiple times. And on top of that, water and holy paraphernalia is basically proven to be pointless against JoJo vampires as well. Though, oddly enough, fire maintained its effectiveness, though Dio did survive the burning mansion, likely dispelling the absolute power it used to have. Though this is also in part due to the fact that JoJo vampires are just leagues more durable than the standard ones, with hyper-regeneration factors that allow them to return from damn near anything, as seen when Joseph blew Straits into literal pieces, only for them to crawl back together and form a full being again, or how Dio was able to heal through drinking blood, and was even able to graft his own head onto Jonathan's body, allowing him to partially take it over. Though regeneration does take time. The one aspect that reigns supreme between JoJo and the folklore is the power of the sun. As much like most versions of vampiric folklore, the sun completely dissolves vampires upon direct contact in JoJo. But on top of that, vampires in JoJo also have to fear the imitation solar energy known as Hamon, which can dissolve them just as effectively, which I assume a similar effect would happen to regular folklore vampires if they were struck with it as well, but that's up in the air. Though, luckily enough, the longer lifespans and extreme durability of the body makes vampires also prime candidates for unlocking stands, with Araki even crediting the stone mask as a useful tool for the creation of stands, but not because the mask itself unlocks them, more so how it can open the door to those who may never have lived to see one. The one aspect of JoJo vampires that isn't fully clear is if the vampiric powers are hereditary, as in folklore, a person can conceive a child with a vampire, they will give birth to a half-breed known as a dempire. The only evidence to suggest that dempires exist in JoJo is found through Giorno, who, during his stand rush, when he's specifically in a foul mood, will let out a vampiric cry, suggesting that he has at least some of that primal fury of vampires buried deep within his soul. But overall, vampires in JoJo are pretty interesting. They're a nice mix of folklore vampires and Araki's own uniqueness, creating possibly one of the most interesting takes on the monster itself. And I hope you enjoyed this video and want to see more videos like in the future. I have a Patreon at patreon.com/ManyNotTheBadGuy, and if you want to reject your own humanity and ascend to a higher place and become a vampire, well, you can do so by buying a copy of Shimonetta at buyshimonetta.com.